Live streaming is on.
All right. Thank you so much for setting this up. Zoltan, welcome to the first of our webinars in the series of bi-weekly webinars organized by Hipther Agency and powered by GamingAmericas.com. Our first webinar is titled Tribal Gaming, a New Era. My name is Jaka Repanšek. I'm a general member of International Masters of Gaming Law based in Ljubljana, Slovenia. It is my honor to introduce our guest speaker today and my fellow IMGL member, Mr. Jonodev Chaudhuri, Chair of Indian Law and Policy Practice at Quarles Brady LLP in Washington, D.C. Jonodev has extensive experience representing tribal nations, tribal citizens, corporations, and individual clients on issues relating to commercial litigation, gaming, governance, tribal sovereignty, and self-determination, and economic development. Having spent his entire career serving tribal nations and native communities in various policy, legal, and judicial capacities, he possesses a deep understanding of the connection between the development of strong governmental institutions and tribal determination. Jonodev, welcome and thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Jaka, and thank you, Zoltan. It's truly an honor to be here. I want to thank Gaming Americas for this incredible seminar that you've set up, and it's an honor to join you and an honor to be part of this public education opportunity that you've created. If you would like me to kind of jump into things, let me know. But
yes, so I was just kind of, before we start with our topic, I would just kindly ask you to maybe say a few more words about yourself and your work, and then I'll introduce our panel and just jump to our first question.
Well, thank you. As you pointed out, I serve as chair of the Quarles Brady Indian Law Practice. We have an incredible team full of practitioners with deep experience in Indian country and deep experience with the federal government. So our law firm is a large law firm serving clients, both tribal and non-clients, throughout the country. We have well over 400 attorneys with offices all over. I have a different hat that I often wear that I'm not wearing today, and that's as ambassador of the Muskogee Creek Nation. I'm extraordinarily honored to serve in that capacity. It's a position that was creation as part of our return to our sovereign diplomatic roots. I'm a citizen of the Muskogee Creek Nation. That's my tribal nation. And we, of course, have been a nation long before the creation of the United States. So to serve as a diplomat for that nation is truly an honor. But that's not the capacity I'm in today. I'm here as a private attorney, and my most recent prior experience was serving as chairman of the National Indian Gaming Commission. That is a federal agency that regulates from the federal side all of Indian gaming in the United States. And the primary regulators of Indian gaming are the tribal nations themselves. But under American law, our agency, or that agency, was created to help regulate, enforce the laws, but also create the laws. So that that agency develops regulations that ensures a healthy and safe framework for Indian gaming. In the process of being appointed to that position, I was very honored to have been nominated by President Barack Obama and unanimously confirmed by the United States Senate. That was a long process, but it was deeply humbling to have the support of our federal leadership in that position, but it was also more to have the support of my nation and so many tribal nations in my service in that capacity. Before that, I served with the Department of the Interior, which is the United States agency that manages a number of critical matters in the U.S., including resource management, but most importantly, affairs relating to the nation-to-nation relationship between tribes and the United States. Prior to that, I served as a judge and a lawyer in various capacities for, since 1999. And so it's really an honor to be here. I got into gaming as an extension of my commitment to helping build strong tribal institutions. And part of that is helping to build tribal economies. Economic development's critical to the future of tribal nations, and gaming has had a profound impact on nation strengthening in Indian country. And so that's a little bit about my background. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much, Jonodev. So what are we going to talk about today? First of all, we have about 45 minutes. And everybody who's listening to us is very welcome to post your questions. We will be seeing them in our chat panel. And if there's any questions I can ask our guest today, I'll be very happy to do so. So in the midst of a global pandemic, there is no shortage of concerns for tribes involving their gaming operations. Questions that arise like, can employees be protected and paid? Will closures be necessary again? What is the best response to an alarming uptick in new cases during the first wave? And what happens if there is a second wave? Will the federal government properly line up to its treaty and trust obligations in this uncertain time if there continues to be a major shortfalls in tribal operating funds? Some tribes and their gaming advocates say resiliency requires new tactic, relying on paths that some wealthier established casino tribes have generally been hesitant to go down and have even lobbied against, including online gaming. Indian gaming experts predict COVID-19 will inevitably cause some of the concerns to alleviate or at least evolve on the tribal, state, and federal fronts, and the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act might never have to be touched. There's a quote, Jonodev, I found on the internet that you recently stated: in the new COVID landscape, which I think we're going to be living in for quite some time, we need to look for ways to intelligently improve the regulatory and statutory framework of Indian gaming and see what can be done to further promote the objectives and other statutes. I would briefly, before I go to my first question, like you to kind of comment on that quote, which I just told and which I just found on the internet that you stated not so long ago. Jonodev, please.
Thank you, Jaka. And I want to be helpful to all the listeners on this program. So I realize that not everyone is familiar with the United States framework for gaming, across the board, but especially as it applies to tribal nations. So that quote in particular relates to that framework. That framework is built around notions unrelated to gaming of tribal sovereignty. Now, tribal nations were independent nations that pre-existed the United States. American law has or continues to recognize and reconcile the sovereignty of tribal nations within the modern federal landscape that America operates under. So it's within that landscape that you have the interplay between sovereigns. You have tribal nations, you have the federal government, and you also have state. There's an intricate statutory framework that regulates those relationships. Now, the larger point that tribal gaming revenue is governmental revenue, and that gaming revenue funds important programs and services. Indian gaming is really an extension of the tribe's ability to engage in self-determination. There's a long body of case law and statutory law that points out that the federal government has a responsibility through treaties with the tribal nations, but also through the trust relationship that comes from various statutes to support tribal economic development. So when I talk about how we all need to intelligently look at the statutory and regulatory framework of Indian gaming to properly allow for economic development in the new COVID landscape, I'm really referring to this complicated framework, this spider web of regulations and statutes that work together to regulate. And all I'm saying is that we need to Indian gaming tribal nations were never supposed to be put at a disadvantage to commercial operators in the conduct of gaming. And given the fact that all customers, whether they're commercial gaming customers or Indian gaming customers, are now more than ever mindful of things like social distancing and things like personal protective equipment, we need to look at allowing tribes to maximize their technologies to get their most important economic development tool out to the public in this new landscape.
Okay, so when we point out that there is a need to improve the regulatory and statutory framework of Indian gaming, can you be more specific? How can we improve it? What is your suggestion to the legislators?
Well, there are numbers of ways to improve it, and there are a number of voices in that conversation. My main point, and there are a number of statutes we could look at. We could look at clarifying the Unlawful Internet Gambling Enforcement Act to further allow the use of modern gaming tools by tribal nations to get their products out. Whatever statute we look at, whether it's that or the Wire Act, I'm typically not a big proponent of touching IGRA and the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act unless it's to improve tribal nations' ability to enhance their economic development profiles. But whatever statute we're looking at, Indian country has to be first and foremost in the legislator's mind. And I always point out that based on federal law, and certainly based on the laws as we know it, and we operate under two foundational laws, the 1987 Cabazon case, Cabazon versus California, Watershed Supreme Court case, and the 1988 Indian Gaming Regulatory Act statute that followed it. Whatever laws we think about addressing, the nation-to-nation relationship between the tribes and the federal government has to come first. That statute that I mentioned, IGRA, and that Supreme Court case recognized that there's an independent, inherent sovereign authority of tribal nations to conduct economic activities on their lands. And everything else that the U.S. government does has to be built around that understanding. And so while there, in the last year or so, sports betting has been a huge topic of discussion. There are many voices in that consideration, including professional sports leagues, including states, including manufacturers. But my point is, whenever you're talking about touching the gaming landscape, whether it's commercial or Indian gaming, you have to keep those primary federal policy goals of supporting tribal economic development, self-sufficiency, and strong tribal government in mind. Those goals are mentioned in IGRA, and they have to drive any policy discussions.
Right. Who has the biggest responsibility right now to move on, and will the November elections catalyze or change the processes in any way?
Well, the biggest interest in moving on are the folks who recognize the realities of the last 5 months or so, or 4 or 5 months. I mean, since the pandemic really emerged, we've all had to look at gaming in a new way. And that's true not just in the United States, but globally. We've all had to think about what types of offerings can facilities provide, can operators provide that still provide value to our customers, but provide peace of mind to our employees, to the general public, and to their customer base. And so, that has a huge impact on vendors in terms of what types of products are in research and development, but it also has a huge impact on regulators and policymakers. So come November, the election will have a huge impact on the recognition that the president and the administration will have on what to support. And there may or may not be any legislative change in the near future. I'm not saying there is. I mean, right now, it's all hands on deck addressing the immediate issues with the pandemic. But should legislative improvements be discussed regarding gaming across the board, sports betting, developing new rules regarding online use of gaming or the use of mobile devices, the leadership and the policymakers have to keep the nation-to-nation relationship between the tribal nations and the federal government in mind as they consider any legislative changes.
Well, thank you, Jonodev. United States have been seen around the world as rather slow in introducing online gaming products and legislation, while, for example, many other jurisdictions around the world have been progressing rather fast, even before the COVID crisis, the Corona crisis. We had a recent panel on a similar topic, and there was a lot of discussion about New Jersey and Pennsylvania as two example states moving quite fast in that direction, trying to seize the opportunity also during the COVID crisis now, trying to pass proper legislation to be the first in the market. Can tribal gaming seize this opportunity and move even faster? This seems to be the perfect timing for tribal gaming to really reposition itself and move faster than the states in general. What is your opinion on that?
There are opportunities, to be sure, but I would have to give a brief primer on the legal landscape if we could take 3 minutes to do that. And the reason I say that is for the listeners to your program outside of the United States, they might be perplexed why things like online gaming isn't allowed throughout the United States. And there are very good reasons for that under our current framework. So if I could just give a 3 to 5 minute primer. Well, for listeners outside the US, a lot of our gaming is governed by state law. And so while there are certainly federal laws that apply to gaming across the board, they basically kind of buffer the rules of state law. So for example, we have things like the Wire Act, which prevent the use of funds being transferred across state lines for illegal purposes. We have things like the Unlawful Internet Gambling Enforcement Act, which again deal with the legality of gaming across jurisdictional lines. There's some case law that's refined that act, but basically gaming has to be legal in both jurisdictions when gaming takes place across jurisdictions. And then we have things like the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act, which talks about tribal nations being the primary regulators. It didn't create anything, by the way. It just affirmed the inherent sovereignty of tribes. Or actually, the Supreme Court case that preceded it affirmed the inherent sovereignty of tribes. IGRA refined that to still place tribes as the primary regulators of their gaming, but created a framework of how tribes work with their surrounding states on things on certain types of gaming, namely class 3 gaming. So because you have the interplay of multiple jurisdictions, there's very little federal legislation that regulates all gaming throughout the federal government. The closest we get is something like the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act. And so because of that, when you have new platforms such as mobile gaming or online gaming, you have to look at what would have to be done from the statutory side of things to allow for them. Additionally, for tribes to operate what's called class 3 gaming, which is pretty much most casino types of games outside of bingo, tribes have to enter into compact with their state government. So it may be perplexing to a lot of folks saying, why aren't folks taking more advantage of the online products that are available? But it's because of the way that our regulatory system is set up. There are certainly benefits to that, but there are some challenges as you try to move quickly with emerging technologies. And we all know gaming technology moves quicker than almost any other industry. I mean, we've been leaders as an industry, and a number of areas in terms of cashless finance and moving away from coins and dollars. Those are things that other industries have learned from us. As an industry, we develop these things, but we still have to work within the regulatory framework that we're in to maximize them. So if you think I should explain that a little bit more, Jaka, please.
No, that's perfect, because I always ask the same question when we have a discussion about the future of especially remote gaming in America. But I come from European Union, and as you know, European Union doesn't regulate gaming on a European Union level. It's left to individual member states, or in general, it's left to individual member states. And there's member states such as Malta and some others who have taken this opportunity really well and have become really the leaders within the European Union and the global market. And it seems like that when I was talking to a representative of New Jersey gaming community, New Jersey is in a way trying to position as a state, as an American Malta, if I may use this metaphor, to be the most progressive, to be the first, because it's not regulated on the federal but on the state level. Thus, they can really move faster and they can be the first one. That's why I was asking the question if the tribal gaming community is considering similar moves as New Jersey is, to your opinion, or it should, or should it do so?
Well, Indian gaming, there's nothing in the congressional record that suggests that Indian gaming should be at a disadvantage to commercial gaming. So with Indian gaming, let's take sports betting, for example. Sports betting is a class 3 gaming the type of gaming under our law. For a tribe to engage in sports betting, it has to go through this compacting process with the state government. So sports betting has to be legal in the state, and then there has to be an agreement with the state. For a commercial gaming operator to engage in sports betting, they just have to meet that first step, that gaming has to be legal in the state, and they're good to go. States aren't always able or interested in authorizing that commercial gaming, because a lot of the times there are exclusivity agreements that require the tribes to have that type of gaming if commercial operators have it. But the point I'm trying to make is, since tribes have a 2-step process to go through with sports betting, namely that the gaming has to be legal in the state, and then they have to get an agreement to the state, that adds an extra layer of transaction time to the process. And as we explore ways to further build on the positive lessons of Indian gaming, we should be looking at ways to streamline those processes in favor of tribal nations so that they aren't at a commercial disadvantage. As we know, especially in the online and modern online commerce, modern e-commerce, first to market is incredibly important. The first market aspect is important in any industry, but in terms of gaming, in terms of branding, in terms of what platforms and companies are trusted, First to market's incredibly important, and tribes should be empowered rather than foreclosed from engaging in that. So I think you're right, Jaka, that tribes want to take advantage of the new landscape, and they're actively trying to do things within their own state governments, and I mean, with their own state partners, I should say, and within the federal government to do that. But it's different from state to state, and there's a number of compact improvements that would need to be made, and a number of federal and state changes in the law that need to be made. I think tribes are exploring any and all options at this moment. It's a very exciting time.
Thank you so much, Jonodev. So tribal gaming revenue is governmental revenue, as you mentioned. Can you give some examples of how tribes use gaming revenue, please?
Yeah, thank you, Jaka. Absolutely. Tribal nations see gaming as a means to an end. And in other words, profits aren't the end in themselves of gaming. Profits are only important in so far as they help propel self-determination. So Indian gaming revenue is governmental revenue. And along those lines, especially when I was NIGC chairman, I saw it broadly across the country, but nations such as my nation have used Indian gaming to build hospitals. My tribal nation has 3 hospitals that we built with Indian gaming, and those hospitals serve tribal members as well as non-tribal members alike. Schools, roads, emergency services, infrastructure, utilities, the utilities that are needed to operate gaming facilities benefit tribal members and non-tribal members alike. For probably most importantly in rural America is jobs. Not all gaming facilities are these giant, as you mentioned, these giant facilities. Many are small, modest facilities. The NIGC numbers typically would point out that the vast majority, somewhere in the range of 70% or so, tribal gaming operations are small to modest Indian gaming facilities, and they're often located in the most rural parts of the country. In those communities, tribal gaming facilities are typically the largest employers in their counties. So they're the largest employers, whether you're talking about Native Americans or not. And so the funds that come in through Indian gaming build governmental infrastructure, they build tribal courts, tribal police, but they also provide much needed jobs, programs, and services for Indians and non-Indians alike.
And what kind of a decrease in revenues have we seen now due to COVID-19? I mean, probably it's been a hard blow, especially the brick and mortar casinos, which had to be closed or semi-closed. What kind of figures are we talking about, Jonodev?
Yeah, we won't know the full impact probably until next year. Every year, the National Indian Gaming Commission releases its gross gaming revenue report. And that's the gross gaming revenue received in Indian gaming for the previous fiscal year. So that's usually issued in the summer. We're probably going to hear those numbers later this summer for last year, but those numbers won't include the COVID impact. We have a lot of numbers that we can read into the dire straits that tribal nations have been in as they've sought CARES Act relief. There have been many strong arguments made by Indian country to point out that Indian gaming effectively subsidizes or supports the federal government's responsibility to provide many of these programs and services that I mentioned. And since Indian gaming, just like industries across the globe, has been impacted by COVID, since they haven't been able to produce the governmental revenue that they typically do. The federal government needs to work with tribal nations to shore up their economies. There's been some modest support by the federal government, thanks to some legislators who understand that, and thanks to the advocacy of tribal leaders. But there needs to be more federal support as the COVID CARES Act type relief packages are discussed. Indian gaming is critical to tribal nations, but also non-tribal communities, and the federal government should do whatever it can to support and bolster this critical industry in its time of need.
Thank you so much. Next question I have prepared for you is, can you talk a little bit about how tribes may use emerging technologies to further support their communities?
Thank you. I mean, so the types of technologies that are being created today are phenomenal. I often say it's like when I talk to manufacturers, when I see what vendors are producing and the way that they're implementing artificial intelligence and data analytics and behavioral science into their products. Some of it's scary, to be honest. I sometimes joke that it's like folks are playing piano with your brain, but that's no different than what supermarkets are doing in terms of trying to figure out which cans of soup to provide to customers. All industries are actively looking at how to produce the best product and produce product that reaches customers in a way that the customers want to be reached. Gaming is no different. Indian gaming has always been a leader in global technology innovation. I mean, we think back to the ticket in and ticket out systems that we have in place across the globe. That came from Indian gaming, and that came from the unique jurisdictional framework that Indian gaming had to work within and develop technology around. Today is different. When the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act was passed in 1988, there was no internet. There was no internet, so to speak. So it didn't contemplate the internet. It certainly didn't contemplate things like artificial intelligence and data analytics. But one good thing it did do, although it stripped many parts of tribal sovereignty away, it left tribal gaming commissions as the primary regulators of their operations. So tribal gaming commissions have an important role to look at these new technologies in their permitting, licensing, and approval processes and figure out what works for their communities. So as these new technologies come into play, and I'm talking, let's talk specifically, I'm talking about how folks can use iPhones to game, how folks can game, across jurisdictional lines, across internet, lines, how folks can connect systems together both in brick and mortar and outside of brick and mortar. As these technologies emerge, tribes should be in a position to take advantage of them, and legislators need to empower tribes. But some of the fascinating ones that I've seen involve really tailoring the experience of the gaming operations to the person themselves. And
exactly.
And there's some amazing stuff out there. There's also improvements to the Class 2, and it's going to be a little bit confusing to non-American listeners, but Class 2 is basically bingo games, and bingo is allowed to use electronic aids under American law. And tribal nations have been very, very successful at innovating around what that means. So much so that players have a positive experience when they play Class 2 games in tribal facilities. Even when they're playing bingo, it's still an exciting experience. Figuring out how to further maximize something like Class 2 is something that people are talking about quite a bit. And in terms of technological changes, it's those developments are really exciting, because for your listeners, when you have Class 2 gaming that doesn't require the same state tribal agreement, we call them compacts, that doesn't require the same state tribal agreements for tribes to operate those types of gaming. So the more that you can innovate around Class 2, the faster you're able to build and get to market with products that can be put on the floor or put into, it doesn't always have to be a brick and mortar floor, but right now under a framework, right now tribes are limited to gaming on their lands, for gaming under IGRA, I should say. But the more that you can use Class 2 games to do it, the faster and the easier it is for tribal nations to do that without state interference.
In a recent webinar, we had a panel. There was a very interesting statement from a representative of New Jersey gaming community saying, we forgot about the player, the user experience. This will be the biggest thing that we have to learn how to change and upgrade, and then introduce new gaming products. How would you comment on that position? We forgot about the player. We were not innovative enough before COVID-19. We need to be more innovative.
Well, I think Indian gaming is a great model for the rest of the world. That ticket in, ticket out model dealt with some very specific limitations that tribes had to work under because of compacts and statutory law. But we did it. We developed ways to do that, and it turned out to be something that everybody wanted. And folks didn't realize that folks wanted it until after the fact, in many ways. Now it's on floors throughout the world. That's a good model for all of us to consider, kind of thinking about things from the consumer perspective, thinking about how customers can integrate gaming into other recreational activities. When I was chairman at National Indian Gaming Commission, I was very honored to have worked with the Agua Caliente ban in California to approve alternative standards to be used for the gaming, for the use of mobile gaming devices in their gaming. And all of their gaming was to continue to be on their lands, but Agua Caliente had a checkerboard, land base, like many tribes do, but it was especially the case with Agua Caliente. Agua Caliente wanted to at least have the option to provide mobile gaming device technology on all parts of its land, but our regulations at the time didn't clearly have a path to do that. So we approved a way to approve alternative standards and tried to streamline that. Mm-hmm. That's still limited to Indian land eligible for gaming under the law, but at least opening things up so that the customer can do things that the customer wants to do. If they're sunbathing and they want to play by a poolside and they want to be able to engage, play their favorite slot machine or play their favorite bingo game, they should be able to do that. And so that's what folks are looking at. Right.
Thank you, Jonodev. There's a question we have from Mr. Joe Valandra. What impact will COVID have on economic development for tribes?
Well, let me just throw a shout out to Joe. He's a former, we didn't overlap, but we're a former colleague. He was a chief of staff at National Indian Gaming Commission, several years ago, and he now is the executive director for Native American Contractors Association. I think the impact is first immediate. I mean, there's an economic impact that we've all felt, that all tribal nations have felt that we need to address. There are emergencies on the ground that so far we battled our way through, but it's been especially hard on small and modest operations. But it's been very hard on large operations. Most tribes, paid their employees during the shutdown. Many tribes did, when no revenue was coming through. And we did that because it was the right thing to do. And not all tribes were able to do that. But right now there's an immediate emergency that we need to address in terms of supporting this industry that's been so important. Most tribes are in the reopening process or have reopened. We need to support that, and we need to support through interagency and intergovernmental cooperation ways to properly in real time assess new spikes in cases, new regional spikes, so that tribal operators can make informed decisions about how to safely, move forward with the reopening and closing. But I think to Joe's point, I think he's asking, well, how are we going to be affected in the long term?
Economically.
Well, economically. In terms of economic development, there are going to be challenges, but there are going to be opportunities as well. As we all look to what the new COVID landscape is going to look like, industries outside of gaming are going to be looking at, mobile access. They're going to be looking at social distancing within brick and mortar areas. And there are benefits if Indian country remains vigilant and at the forefront of policy developments. I have no doubt we'll be part of any innovation that comes from that. But there will also be benefits to kind of secondary industries. So we often talk about Indian gaming as approximately $34 billion industry. What we're talking about there is really only direct gaming revenue, gross gaming revenue. We have to keep in mind a lot of that doesn't always go directly to tribal programs. There's a lot of, hidden costs that go to that. But the real revenue streams that come from that are in terms of indirect impact. The National Indian Gaming Association's most recent numbers point out that the indirect impact to the American economy is well over $100 billion, making it the 12th largest employer in the country. Indian gaming, not commercial gaming, Indian gaming. Those downstream industries, namely industries that provide critical services to Indian gaming, are terribly impacted right now. I'm thinking of food and beverage. I'm thinking of the service industry. I'm thinking of all the employees that work for Indian gaming. But there will be benefits as we come out of this current crisis and move into a new day. There will be benefits, and hopefully there'll be major benefits to Indian-owned businesses in terms of providing the needed type of company support to things like new social distancing, carousels in the casinos, or reimagining gaming floors, reimagining our gaming experience as both indoor and outdoor, and all these things. There's going to be a lot of secondary downstream challenges, but opportunities as well.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Mr. Joe Valandra, for your question. I would like to encourage everybody who is listening to us to post your questions to the chat section of our panel, and we'll be happy to answer your questions. Meanwhile, I found a quote from Mr. Joe Valandra on internet when I was preparing for the panel, and I would like to go back to this point. And he posed this question: why is there still a reluctance to fully support online gaming? And I think he was referring to the Indian gaming community or industry in general. Why is there, to your opinion, still a reluctance to fully support online gaming? You answered part of that question because of regulation in states, but I think the question is broader. That's why I'm going back to this question to go deeper into this.
Jaka. Well, for your listeners, it's important to keep in mind that tribal nations are not homogenous. The Indian gaming community is not a homogenous community, meaning there are well over 500, 574, I think is the number right now, federally recognized tribes in the United States. Not all of which conduct gaming, but they all are independent sovereign nations. Within those that do conduct gaming, the approximately 250 tribal nations conducting, a little less than 500 gaming facilities, or operating a little less than 500 gaming facilities across the nation. Not all of them are in the same position. As you touched on before, there are large operations that are some of which are close to metropolitan areas, and then we run the gamut from that all the way to small gaming operations that run small gaming facilities and truck stops in very rural communities. So the Indian gaming community is not homogenous. I want that to be the first point. The second point I want to make for your listeners is, the folks who are Indian gaming, the Indian tribal nations that conduct Indian gaming, they're savvy. They recognize that there's only one Amazon and there's only one eBay. First to market is very important whenever you're dealing with online activities. And since you have gaming operators from all these sovereign nations across the country, all working to build their own nations, the natural question is, if we authorize online gaming, who's going to be the Amazon and eBay of Indian gaming? So there is a concern that not everybody will equally benefit from online gaming, and that's a valid concern. Second of all, because Indian country has turned lemons into lemonade, meaning the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act restricted tribal sovereignty, but did it in a way that protected critical aspects of tribal sovereignty. At the same time, Indian country made the best of it. They were limited to brick and mortar operations on their land. So they said, okay, we're going to do whatever we can to innovate within that framework. And they built the industry that we have today. And there are people that are understandably very protective of this industry that's been so powerful in Indian country. So there are natural concerns about not wrecking what we built in exchange for trying to build something new. But it's not necessarily an either or. I mean, I think there's room for creativity and intelligence in terms of thinking about frameworks that equitably benefit everybody, that build rather than take down, build on rather than take down the gains made in Indian gaming since before IGRA and in the 32 years after it. There are ways to do it, but people have to do it intelligently. Namely, we have to be sensitive to not all tribal nations being in the same spot, and the interest that the federal government has in upholding its responsibilities, the interest that we have in protecting the nation-to-nation relationship that's in place, and the interest that we all have in not creating kingmakers and not creating one Amazon in Indian country when it comes to Indian gaming. So I think that's played into the reluctance a little bit.
Right. Thank you. There's obviously natural concerns also in European Union about introduction of online gaming, but the winners, and that's pretty much proven on the market, the winners are those member states who moved faster. So there is a lesson to learn also from our experience in the European Union. Another question, we're slowly coming to the end of our really interesting discussion, but I have a couple of more questions I would like to ask you. Could opening of the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act dangerous? Could it be a danger for the federal policymakers to use that opportunity to limit tribal sovereignty? I know it's a very tough question, but I would like to hear your answer on that one, please.
Sure. I mean, many advocates of Indian gaming, including myself, have always shared words of caution when we talk about improving the regulatory landscape. There are plenty of things that can be done separate and apart from IGRA to do that, but we've always shared a cautionary note when folks say, well, let's just change IGRA. You have to remember that IGRA itself was not an expansion of sovereignty, it was a reduction in sovereignty, and the protections that remained in IGRA of sovereignty were hard fought. They didn't come out of nowhere. They came because of heroic tribal leaders that fought for them. And I would start naming names right now, but it would take all day. But it wasn't by accident that the ship was not lost when IGRA was passed. And people remember that time because there were many, frankly, anti-tribal sovereignty voices that ran to Congress after the watershed Cabazon decision in '87 and tried to strip tribes of all authority to game and tried to strip tribes of all authority to regulate gaming on their lands. So there's a concern, and it's a legitimate concern, that if you open IGRA up at the wrong time, the folks who do not support tribal sovereignty, and there are always those voices, they may engage in mischief in the legislation. So I agree, you have to be very, very careful whenever you talk about amending IGRA. But certainly there are things that don't necessarily come from IGRA that could be looked at. I mean, IGRA doesn't prevent or empower tribal nations to engage on gaming off their lands. All it does is say this law basically applies to gaming on your lands. It doesn't say you can't game off it. That for that, other laws apply. It doesn't really say yes or no on that. But other laws do speak to that. I mentioned the Water Act and Unlawful Internet Gambling Enforcement Act. I think if folks want to take a look at the total landscape, and these discussions have come up in the context of sports betting as well. Should we have a federal sports betting bill? What should we do on that? Whatever we do, the fundamental goal of the federal government to support strong tribal government has to drive that train. Even if other industries are impacted, because with all respect to other industries, those are dealings with commercial industries. When you talk about Indian law, when you talk about tribal nations, you're talking about governmental relationships that were part of the foundation of this country. Let me just throw a little historical note for your listeners. When the United States, after the Revolution, was struggling for legitimacy in the eyes of the world, it looked to tribal nations to engage in treaty making to show that legitimacy. Okay. So a fundamental aspect of being a sovereign nation is to engage in treaties. That's what sovereigns do. It was unclear after the Revolution how seriously the United States would be taken. And in its time of need, tribal nations, not always under the best circumstances, a lot of the times it was under duress of our own. But in the United States' time of need, tribal nations entered into treaties with the United States and gave the United States that legitimacy on the world stage. So these treaty obligations aren't just lip service. They go to the foundation of the nation, of the United States. So whenever we talk about, hey, it's important to have new legislation in sports betting, the foundational principles of federal law, of the United States law, have to drive that train, and that's all we're saying.
Thank you so much. We have another question from our audience. If you could change one thing about tribal gaming, what would it be?
Well, if I had a magic wand, I'm a big. I was the chief regulator on the federal side under the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act framework for many years. I respect when I say we, Indian country has made of that act. But for the life of me, I don't know why tribal nations shouldn't be able to simply engage in economic development on their own lands in their own way as any sovereign does. I'm a big believer in that, and I don't think there's anything scary about that. The lesson of Indian gaming is that Indian gaming benefits everybody, states and tribes alike. The economic benefit to state citizens are now abundantly clear. There's abundant proof in economic impact study after economic impact study that through infrastructure, jobs, programs, and services, non-tribal members benefit tremendously from Indian gaming. I don't think that should be a scary concept to allow tribal nations to engage in economic development based on their inherent sovereignty. So if I could change one thing, is to remove the concerns that non-tribal citizens may have about true sovereignty, economic development sovereignty on tribal lands. There may be other little things I'd change, but I'd start with them.
All right, thank you so much. And last but not least, I'd like to ask you this question. I mean, rarely we have so much coverage of legislation in the Supreme Court of the United States here in Europe as we did in the last days. And there was a historic Supreme Court case, mainly dealing with Oklahoma. And I would just like you to briefly explain a few words about that, because listeners from around the world were reading about it. And I know you're very well acquainted with what was going on. So please, a few words about that Supreme Court case.
Thank you, Jaka. And let me make clear, as I answer this, I'm not serving in my capacity as ambassador of the Muskogee Creek Nation. I'm serving solely in my private capacity as a citizen and as a lawyer who follows Indian law. But that case did involve my tribe's lands. And there's an underlying criminal case that is, it's difficult, as many criminal cases are, to talk about. But by the time a case like that gets to the United States Supreme Court, you're dealing with issues of constitutional law, treaty interpretation, and longstanding federal Indian law. That's what governs the case. And for your listeners, Justice Gorsuch, in what I think will go down as one of the foundational opinions of the last 100 years, wrote a beautiful, beautiful opinion that is remarkable in its simplicity. It's remarkable in its intellectual honesty in terms of upholding the law and looking at precedent and saying, unless Congress has disestablished or, just layperson's terms, destroyed a reservation, that reservation continues to exist. And this was very important for the lands in question. The Creek Nation lands had survived the creation of Oklahoma statehood, had survived the allotment, assimilationist policies of the federal government, which is a whole story in itself. We've survived the Trail of Tears. We were originally moved from Georgia, Alabama, and northern Florida to where we are today in Oklahoma. We've survived a lot. The question has become, the question was, despite all of that, was our reservation destroyed? And Justice Gorsuch simply said in beautiful prose, no. He refused to accept the argument that was presented, that because of all these actions, our reservation was destroyed. So it's a beautiful decision. In its immediate impact, it's limited to the criminal jurisdiction that was in question. There will be other implications of the case that will get sorted out over time. But the reason it's so powerful for our nation and so many tribes across the country, and so many Indian people just simply across the country, is that the highest court of the federal government recognized that we're not strangers in our own lands, that our own lands continue to be our home, and that our reservation still remains in full force and effect. Now, in terms of its immediate impact on gaming, it will be minimal, but and we can talk more about that, and maybe we'll have another seminar on that specifically. But symbolically, the fact that we haven't been erased from our own lands is powerful. And I'm just grateful to the Supreme Court for recognizing that history. If Congress wants to disestablish tribal nations' lands, it has to show its face to the world when it does it.
Mr. Jonodev Chaudhuri, it's been really, really awesome to talk to you. Thank you so very much. We've come to the end of our discussion of our webinar. Thank you to everybody who was listening from around the world. I think a virtual applause is very well in place. So thank you once more for everything we've learned about today. Hope to speak to you soon again, and stay safe and have a great time.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure and an honor. Thank you.
It's been a pleasure. Bye-bye. Thank you so much. Bye.